All right. So, you know, I can tell you about this thing that happened to me at Pike Place Market in Seattle. Really stuck with me. The place was, well, just buzzing with activity and all. And I saw this like absolutely beautiful king salmon, right? So I'm thinking, oh, this is going to cost me an arm and a leg. And I asked the vendor the price and get this. He goes, $3.50 a pound.
Wow. That's quite a deal. I mean, what was his reasoning?
Yeah, that's exactly what I thought. So I'm like, okay, what's the catch? And he just flips the fish over, points to this tiny little like flaw on the tail. You could barely even see it, maybe a couple missing scales or something. And he says, caught 4 hours ago, just need a small profit, that's all. And here's the kicker. I tried to pay him more, like genuinely, and he flat out refused. We couldn't agree on me overpaying, so, I mean, the deal fell through. It was weird, And it got me thinking about something you mentioned in the material for this deep dive. Maybe this whole idea of like radical honesty, it's not really how the world, especially the business world, actually works.
It's definitely a fascinating contrast, right? Like this idealized vision of the marketplace where everyone's totally transparent and just like acts out of pure selflessness. Sounds great in theory, but I mean, as the sources we're looking at today point out, the real energy of a place like Pike Place, it comes from a slightly more strategic approach, you could say.
Yeah, exactly. And that brings us to like the heart of this deep dive. You've got this really compelling argument that cheating, even though we usually think of it as bad, actually plays this surprisingly vital role in our economies, our social lives, even how our brains develop. So for everyone listening, we're not here to like debate whether cheating is right or wrong, but rather let's explore what it looks like, the different forms it takes and how we all navigate a world where it seems to be, well, kind of everywhere.
Exactly. And to really kick things off, let's start with the marketplace. Adam Smith, right? The big name in economics. He famously said that our dinner, it doesn't come from the baker being nice. It comes from his own self-interest. That drive to make a profit, to maximize what he gets, that's the engine of our entire economic system. Your salmon vendor, admirable as he might be, is kind of like living in a business utopia, right? A world that doesn't quite map onto how things usually play out in a free market.
Okay, so let's break down this self-interest idea for a second. Because even in what seems like a pretty straightforward transaction, like haggling over a price, there's already this element of, well, deception built in, isn't there?
Absolutely. I mean, both the buyer and the seller are trying to get the best outcome for themselves, right?
Right.
And that often means, maybe exaggerating a little, like saying you're only willing to pay this much or that you'll walk away if they don't come down on the price, a little white lie here and there to get the upper hand.
Right. It's like a game of strategy. Everyone's trying to outmaneuver the other person. And I mean, sure, you might feel a bit bummed if you think you overpaid, but generally we all accept this back and forth, this kind of tactical play as just part of how the market works.
Exactly. It's like an unspoken rule of the game. But, and this is where it gets really interesting, this kind of strategic maneuvering isn't just limited to haggling, right? Think about the example from the material about Google acquiring YouTube.
Oh, yeah. If Google had just come out and said, okay, here's everything we know, and here's our absolute best offer, take it or leave it, they might have actually gotten into legal trouble. Something about industrial espionage, right? So in that case, being completely honest wasn't just a bad strategy. It could have had some serious consequences.
Exactly, which kind of blows apart this simplistic idea that honesty is always the best policy. Sometimes it's just not how the game is played. And, what's even more fascinating is that even in places like supermarkets where you have fixed prices, there's still all sorts of subtle, let's call them persuasion techniques at work.
Oh, yeah, totally. Yeah. Like the way the store is laid out, those impulse buys near the checkout. Or like how they put the more expensive stuff at eye level. Oh, and don't forget the sugary cereals on the lower shelves, right? Designed to appeal to kids. Like they're playing with our minds.
Well, they are playing with our minds. That's the whole point of marketing, right? It's not just about giving you information. It's about using psychology to, well, nudge you in a certain direction. And for everyone listening, this raises a really interesting question. How much control do we actually have over our choices in these carefully designed environments? I mean, at what point does this kind of subtle manipulation cross the line into, what we'd call cheating?
Right. It's like, are we being tricked or are we willingly playing along? It's a blurry line, for sure. And it brings up another big question that the material tackles head on, the role of morality in the market. Because it seems like the main rule is if it's legal, it's fair game. But that doesn't always sit right ethically speaking, does it?
It's a tricky one. Milton Friedman, another giant in economics, he argued that a company's main responsibility is to make money for its shareholders. As long as they're operating within the law and following, generally accepted business practices, he'd say they're doing their job. But as you pointed out, that leaves a lot of wiggle room, ethically speaking.
Yeah, like the current rules mostly focus on making sure companies are honest about what's in their products and any potential risks. But that still leaves a whole lot of space for these kind of manipulative tactics. Shilling, bait and switch, viral marketing campaigns that prey on our FOMO or whatever.
Yeah.
It's all designed to get us to buy stuff we might not actually need.
And that's where those two laws of cheating come in, right? The first one, not spreading outright lies, is what companies are legally obligated to follow. But the second one, using deception to exploit those cognitive loopholes we all have, well, that's where they get to play. I mean, think about it. Have you ever seen a company actively advertise the downsides of their product? Unless there's a legal requirement, those warnings are usually buried in the fine print somewhere.
Right, exactly. It's like, hey, here's this amazing product. Oh, by the way, it might explode, but we put that in size 4 font on the back, so good luck finding it. So we're back to those big, thorny questions, aren't we? Can we even function as a society, at all without some level of deception? Are some lies just, baked into the system? And so where do we draw the line? How do we live in this kind of world?
But it gets even more complex, right? Because you're also arguing that being too honest can actually be a disadvantage, socially speaking. Right. The material talks about this anecdote from Lixing Sun about a newborn baby. The people who told these flattering but, untrue predictions about the baby's future, they were praised and welcomed. But the one person who just stated the obvious, that the baby would eventually die, well, they were met with anger and resentment. It really shows how, in social situations, sometimes the blunt truth is punished, and those so-called white lies are not just accepted, but actually expected.
It's like the idea of honesty being this universal, absolute thing kind of falls apart when you look at it that way. It seems like it's really shaped by the specific community and culture you're in. And, you even bring up figures like Washington, Trump, Socrates, all these people who, in different ways, found their own personal ideas of honesty clashing with what society expected of them. And sometimes those clashes had, pretty serious consequences.
Absolutely. And what's even more interesting is how society kind of dictates these unspoken rules about how honest you're supposed to be in different situations. Take applying for a job, for instance. If you wrote a completely honest resume, listing all your weaknesses and all the times you messed up, well, it'd probably go straight in the trash, even if it was technically accurate.
Right. That's the peril of honesty in action. Your personal commitment to being transparent clashes with what society expects, which is to present yourself in the best possible light, even if it means bending the truth a little.
Yeah.
You also had that scenario about a wife giving her husband some brutally honest feedback about his looks right before a big event. We all kind of know instinctively that even if she's right, it's not going to go over well. And then there was that BBC honesty experiment, right, where people tried to live without telling any lies, even little white lies. And it just turned out to be incredibly difficult to navigate even basic social interactions.
Exactly. That experiment really showed how those little white lies, they actually serve these important social functions. Their way of showing empathy, offering support, signaling that you don't have bad intentions. Without them, you risk coming across as cold, insensitive, maybe even a little bit clueless socially. It really emphasizes how social honesty isn't always about sticking to the literal truth. It's more about managing perceptions and keeping things, running smoothly.
So it's like this cheating, this putting on a bit of a social mask, it becomes almost essential for navigating the world, especially if you want to succeed professionally. Imagine a lawyer showing up to court in sweatpants and flip-flops. No matter how brilliant they are, it's not exactly inspiring confidence, is it? Or that financial advisor who looks like they just rolled out of bed.
Yeah.
Probably not attracting a lot of clients. We do judge books by their covers, especially in today's world, where everything's so fast-paced and first impressions matter so much. And even people who've made it, the rich and famous, they're often playing this game too, right? Putting on a carefully crafted image to hide any kind of vulnerabilities they might have.
Absolutely. Whether it's makeup and clothing or the carefully crafted personas we see in the media, we're always trying to present a certain image to the world. And it makes you wonder, right? What would happen if we all just stopped caring about how we look? What would be the impact? I mean, entire industries would probably collapse. Fashion, cosmetics, all those personal grooming services. It's pretty mind-blowing to think about.
Yeah.
So this kind of cheating, this presenting an enhanced version of ourselves, it's really woven into the fabric of our economy and our culture.
And it goes even deeper than that, right? You're saying that cheating is actually essential to, well, to culture and art themselves. Like literature, novels, memoirs, they're all based on make-believe, right?
Yeah.
Selective storytelling, embellishing details, sometimes just straight-up fiction.
Right. And what's really thought-provoking is how even genres that aim for factual accuracy, like nonfiction, can blur the lines a bit. There's this famous debate between Malcolm Gladwell and Christopher Chabris about this. Gladwell admits to playing a bit loose with the facts sometimes, prioritizing the narrative impact over being completely 100% accurate. So it raises the question, is there an ethical problem with making information more engaging, even if it means, stretching the truth a bit?
Right. It's like how much artistic license is too much. But you make this really important point that, these stories, whether they're perfectly accurate or not, they serve a purpose. They evoke emotions. They spark our imagination. They make us think in ways that just dry facts might not. And it's not just literature, right? Think about the illusions created in paintings, music, movies. Even the way movies themselves create this illusion of movement from a bunch of still images. It's all about cheating our senses in a way to give us new experiences.
And here's the really interesting part. The material even suggests that cheating helps us define our moral values. It's like, without lies, would we even care about honesty? Without betrayal, how would we understand the value of true friendship? Without infidelity, what would devotion even mean? It's the existence of these so-called negative things that actually help us appreciate the good stuff even more.
It's almost like we need the darkness to see the light, And we keep coming back to this idea that cheating, even though we tend to think of it as bad, it's actually woven into our lives in all these ways.
Yeah.
You even bring in Socrates, who was all about truth and integrity, right? But even he recognized that sometimes you have to be what we pretend to be to live honorably in society.
Right. And David Livingston Smith, he takes it even further. He calls cheating the Cinderella of human nature, like it's this essential element that we try to hide or ignore. He says that human society in a lot of ways is built on this complex web of lies and deceptions. Like if everyone was brutally honest all the time, the whole thing might just fall apart.
It's a bit unsettling to think about, isn't it? But it also makes a weird kind of sense. And it's not just about, being polite or telling good stories. You're saying that certain types of cheating, like forcing yourself to stay positive when things are tough, or using euphemisms to make hard truths easier to swallow, these are actually necessary for communication and building relationships. So sometimes a little bit of dishonesty can actually be a way of showing genuine care and empathy, which is, well, it's kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is, and it gets even more interesting when you look at how dealing with deception can actually make us smarter. Like the very act of trying to figure out if someone's lying, paying attention to those subtle facial expressions, inconsistencies in what they're saying, their body language, all of that, it sharpens our minds. We're not naturally great at lie detection, but research shows that we can get much better at it with practice.
And it's wild to think about how early this stuff starts. You said that even babies, like 6 months old, might fake cry to get attention. And most 2.5-year-olds are already lying, like multiple times an hour. It starts out as self-serving, but as they get older, it becomes more about protecting other people's feelings. Victoria Talwar, she has this framework of the 3 stages of lying in kids: primary, secondary, tertiary lies. It's really fascinating to see how this stuff develops.
What's really amazing is how this ability to lie, it's actually connected to other important cognitive skills, like being able to understand another person's perspective, what they're thinking and feeling. Some studies even show a link between intelligence and being good at both lying and detecting lies. Autistic children are kind of an exception here, but for most people, it seems like there's a correlation. Even those simple childhood games like peekaboo and hide and seek, they contribute to developing these skills along with language abilities. And of course, society plays a big role in teaching kids the rules of lying, right? When is it okay? When is it not okay? The difference between pro-social lies, the ones that help people, and anti-social lies, the ones that hurt people. It's all part of growing up and developing morally.
So it seems like cheating is not only everywhere and often necessary, but it actually helps us develop mentally and morally. But there's still that big ethical question hanging over all of this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is it ever really right to cheat? You talked about this by comparing Kant's ideas, the ontological ethics, with consequentialism.
Right. Immanuel Kant, he was all about the categorical imperative. Basically, he said lying is always wrong, no matter what. Even if you had to lie to a murderer to protect your friend, he'd say you shouldn't do it. His argument was that lying, it corrupts the source of right, it violates our duty to be truthful, and it undermines the trust that we need for society to function. For Kant, telling the truth was an absolute duty, regardless of the consequences.
But as you pointed out, that kind of black and white thinking can be really tough to swallow in real life.
Yeah.
Like, who wouldn't lie to save someone's life, even if it meant breaking some abstract philosophical rule? And you mentioned how Benjamin Constant, who lived around the same time as Kant, challenged that idea directly. He said that the murderer doesn't have a right to truth if it's going to hurt others. So in that case, there's no obligation to be truthful.
It's a really interesting point, right? Because it gets to the heart of the problem with trying to apply these absolute rules to real life, which is messy and complicated. Trying to figure out when it's okay to break those rules from a purely deontological perspective, it just gets really tricky. And that's where consequentialism comes in. It shifts the focus from whether an action is inherently right or wrong to, well, what are the likely outcomes? What will create the most good for the most people? Even before consequentialism was a thing, people like St. Augustine were already classifying lies based on how bad they were, how much harm they caused.
And you brought up this more practical three-category system for lies.
Right.
Pro-social, antisocial,
Yeah.
and self-serving. It seems like a much easier way to navigate all those ethical gray areas.
Right. It's a more nuanced way to look at it. So pro-social lies, the ones that are meant to help or protect others and don't cause any harm and there's no other way to be truthful, those become potentially ethical under this framework, like lying to a murderer to protect someone, what Oskar Schindler did to save lives during the Holocaust, even those little white lies we tell to avoid hurting someone's feelings, or using placebos in medicine when it's in the patient's best interest. And this idea, this pro-social condition, it can even be used to justify certain things like, putting healthier food in more prominent places.
But you were careful to say that this isn't a free pass to lie whenever you think it's for someone's good. There has to be a real reason why you can't tell the truth, and the lie shouldn't actually hurt anyone. You even gave examples of pro-social lies that would still be wrong, like that superintendent who committed insurance fraud. And you made a distinction between compliments, which are meant to build people up, and flattery, which is just manipulation.
Exactly. Nuance is key. And of course, it gets even more complicated when you factor in different cultures. What's considered a harmless white lie in one culture might be deeply offensive in another, like lying about offering coffee to someone who's Morin, or the different ways that American and Chinese cultures approach truth-telling about terminal illness. It shows how important it is to consider the cultural context when you're evaluating whether a lie is ethical or not. Antisocial lies, the ones that are meant to hurt people for personal gain, those were pretty much universally wrong. Things like political manipulation, spreading false information to damage someone's reputation, that kind of thing. Self-serving lies, like bragging or exaggerating in advertising, those fall into more of a gray area. They can erode trust, so we shouldn't encourage them, but maybe they're tolerable in certain situations if they don't really hurt anyone and they're within the norms of society. But like the example of all those misleading statements during the real estate bubble, just because something's considered normal doesn't automatically make it ethical.
That leads us to this whole issue of information control, which is huge in our digital world. Kant's idea of a right to know, it made sense in his time in a smaller, more trusting community. But in our world, where we're constantly interacting with strangers online, it gets a lot trickier.
Right. That default assumption that everyone has a right to know everything, it doesn't really hold up online. We're constantly interacting with people we don't know, and some of them might have bad intentions. So protecting our personal information becomes really important. That's why a lot of us use fake information online about our birthdays or addresses, even our names sometimes. It's a way to protect ourselves, and it doesn't really harm anyone. So under the framework we've been talking about, it could be seen as a permissible form of self-serving deception.
And you're arguing for a pretty fundamental shift in thinking when it comes to private information online. Instead of assuming a right to know, you're saying the default should be a right to privacy. So people shouldn't have access to our personal information unless we specifically give it to them. That would make things like gossiping pretty unethical, wouldn't it? But you also maintain that for public information, especially stuff related to the government, the right to know is still crucial in a democracy. Transparency and accountability are important.
Exactly. The context matters. Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and look at this from an evolutionary perspective. How did deception come about, and what are some ways to deal with antisocial cheating? Now, despite all the talk about how widespread cheating is, research actually suggests that humans are, at their core, pretty cooperative. There's this study, the Lost Wallet experiment, where they left wallets with money in them in different cities and tracked how many were returned. Surprisingly, a lot of them were returned, even the ones with a significant amount of cash. It suggests that people generally do care about others' well-being and are willing to cooperate.
But even if antisocial cheating is relatively rare, it can still cause huge problems. Think about tax evasion, corruption, all that stuff that erodes trust in society and makes everything more difficult and expensive. And the internet has just made things worse, right? It's so much easier to spread spam and scams online, and they can reach way more people. That warning from the French ministry about all these sophisticated manipulation tactics and what happened with the January 6th Capitol riot in the U.S., fueled by all that disinformation, it shows just how dangerous this stuff can be.
Absolutely. The sources we're looking at, they're pretty critical of the traditional approach to cheating, which is basically to try and eliminate it completely through laws and moral education. They say it's probably not going to work. A more realistic approach would be to focus on containment. Like Tamar Frankel, she talks about how to spot red flags in scams and how to keep your emotions out of business decisions. That's good advice for individuals.
And you brought up this idea of inoculation, which is pretty fascinating. The idea is to expose yourself to weakened versions of false information so that you build up a resistance to it, kind of like how vaccines work, right? This led to the idea of using a germ-inspired model for fighting antisocial cheating, which draws parallels between how diseases spread and how deception spreads.
It's a really interesting analogy. They look at the origins of both, how they attack, the harm they cause, the preventive measures we can take, and the ultimate goal, which is containment, not eradication, like building up a societal immunity to this stuff. There was that public campaign in Hangzhou, China, against digital fraud, which is a good example of proactive prevention.
Right. And you talked about how hard policing, like banning disinformation outright, can be problematic. It's often reactive and it can run into issues with free speech. You proposed this idea of soft policing, like using YouTube as an example. What if they rewarded content creators who were truthful, maybe through fact-checking initiatives or adjusting how they pay people? That could be a more effective way to deal with the problem.
It's a more proactive approach, for sure. And here's the funny thing. The existence of antisocial cheating can actually drive innovation. Think about the cybersecurity industry. Companies like CrowdStrike, they were instrumental in figuring out the DNC hack, right? That whole industry wouldn't exist in its current form without the constant threat of malicious activity online. The fact that the cybersecurity market is growing so rapidly and the huge financial impact of cybercrime, it shows how these things are connected. We probably can't get rid of malicious deception online entirely, but it definitely pushes us to develop new technologies to combat it.
It's like an arms race,
Right.
constantly evolving. So to wrap things up, you talked about those two fundamental laws of cheating: altering information and exploiting our cognitive weaknesses. Understanding these laws, it can help us fight back against the harmful forms of cheating. It's like an ongoing battle where the goal is to manage the threat, not to wipe it out completely.
Exactly. So for our listeners, the key takeaway here is that cheating, even though we usually think of it as a bad thing, it plays this incredibly complex role in our lives. It affects our economies, our social interactions, our mental development, even our culture. We've seen how it can be both destructive and, in some ways, beneficial.
And it takes us back to that story about the king salmon, right? Even that seemingly honest transaction at Pike Place Market, it exists within this bigger system of strategies and social norms. It makes you wonder how much of what we perceive as honesty is really just, well, part of a bigger game.
Right. It's all about perspective. And to leave you with something to think about, I want to bring up this quote from Hegel. What is rational is real, and what is real is rational. Maybe instead of just condemning cheating outright, we need to understand that it's a part of reality and figure out how to contain the harmful aspects of it, while also recognizing that it can drive progress and innovation.
So we leave you with this question. How does this new understanding of cheating, its complexities, and its pervasiveness, how does it change the way you think about honesty and deception in your own life and in the world around you?